All right, we should get started to make sure that we use your time as well as possible. So this week is period 4, 1800-1848. The time frame itself, the dates that you want to be looking at are Jefferson's election through the the Mexican-American War. There's always my tripping point, Mexican-American War. What you're examining when you take a look at the war itself, then, is we're taking a look at, when we take a look at the time period, we're looking at the development of nationalism moving to sectionalism. And so when you think about this packet right here, this is totally set up for a Causes of the Civil War essay question, and that's very much what I would be building towards. It's also built for a compare-contrast question between Jefferson and Jackson, and we'll highlight that today. But much more important is that sectionalism piece that we want to be able to dial into. So you've got a few key concepts in period 4. First one, the United States began to develop a modern democracy, celebrated a new national culture with Americans, while Americans sought to define the nation's democratic ideals and change their society and institutions to match them. This is usually your fluffy, big concept. This is the one that we really want to be able to peel into, is these Roman numerals underneath. So when we think about the national transition to a more participatory democracy, you're going to see expanded suffrage. And when you see that, that's referring to Jeffersonian democracy, where you see the common people, who are the farmers, taking the presidency away from John Adams. But even more so, Jacksonian democracy, the era of the common man, is what they're highlighting for you. And they're giving you a signal that they want to be able to compare and contrast those two. But what we're going to see is this is all going to lead to an explosion of political parties that's going to emerge after 1800. The political parties that you want to be able to notice are Federalists versus Democratic Republicans, and then Democrat versus Whigs. And so those two political groupings are going to highlight then the study that you're doing going forward. First of all, notice in the early 1800s, national political parties continued to debate issues such as the tariff, powers of the federal government, and relations with European powers. So let's peel apart what each of those things mean. Number one, the political parties are debating at that time the idea of a tariff created by Alexander Hamilton for what reason? Well, this is meant to be paying off the Revolutionary War debts that we've assumed. So we had an excise tax, we then add in tariffs, and these are revenue tariffs that are meant to help make money to pay down our debts. We're also going to see that there's debates over the powers of the federal government, especially the battle over loose versus strict constructionism. Loose constructionism, the elastic clause, is Alexander Hamilton. Jefferson is more strict constructionist until the Louisiana Purchase during his presidency, and then he starts getting soft on that. Finally, relations with European powers is going to become the major thing that you're studying with Jefferson and the Madison presidencies, especially the battle between America and the French and the British, and their practice of impressment, where they are capturing sailors on American ships and they're harassing our ships that are going overseas. Remember, during this time period, America is going to try to avoid war. That was George Washington's advice. So remember these three events when it comes to Jefferson's time dealing with the French and the British. He creates the Embargo Act. We're not going to trade with anybody, which makes New England really mad. Embargo Act is followed by Macon's Bill number 2 and the Non-Intercourse Acts, where we're trying to figure out ways to leverage the Europeans to be friendly to us. And then finally it leads to the War of 1812. War of 1812 is going to lead to the era of good feelings because the Federalist Party is going to die out with the Hartford Convention, but with the War of 1812, remember the causes, turning points, conclusions. Causes of the War of 1812 is impressment and a scheme to invade Canada to take away from the British. But our militia are not up for that, and so we're going to have a war that gets stalemated. The two turning points that you'll want to be able to notice is, number one, on the Great Lakes, America is going to score victories with our Navy against the British to stop an invasion, but we will have Washington, D.C. get burned to the ground, which is an embarrassment for the United States. Another turning point is the treaty itself, the Treaty of Ghent, which brings the war to an end, but we still have a final battle in New Orleans with Andrew Jackson, which is the mouth of the Mississippi River. So if Jackson loses that battle, Mississippi is then not under our control, and that means all of our trade in the Midwest is then blown up. And so it's desperate that Jackson's able to protect that. For letter B, When it talks about Supreme Court decisions determining the meaning of the Constitution, this is all about John Adams' decision in 1801 to create the Midnight Judges with the Judiciary Act of 1801. The most famous of the judges in that time is going to be John Marshall. And the most important of his Supreme Court decisions is Marbury versus Madison, that sets down the idea of judicial review. I gave you the cram packet, though, the packet of doom, and it has a list for you of all the important Marshall Court decisions. This is probably a place where you'll need to spend some time reviewing over the next few weeks because most kids struggle with this. But if you're aware of that and you can get better with these court cases, the better off you'll be. And so just make a note for yourself that that's something that you want to work on. And remember, you can come back to me and ask for explanations about any of those things and you'll be fine. What we want to remember, though, is during this period of the early 1800s, one of the battles we're getting into is the idea of loose constructionism, especially economics. And so remember that we allowed the Bank of the United States to expire in 1789. 20 years later in 1809, it was created in 1789, 20 years later, 1809, it goes out of business. Then we discovered we really could have used one during the War of 1812, and we created another one right after the War of 1812 was done. The problem with that new bus that's created, though, is it's got a 20-year charter, which means it can then expire during the tail end of Andrew Jackson's second term, which means it's vulnerable, although nobody anticipates that at the time.
Brianna Jensen, please go to the front foyer to the security office. Brianna Jensen to the security office.
Roman numeral number 2 on the next page, then. Sorry, I missed out on the bottom of the page. Letter C. Sorry about that. In the 1820s and 1830s, you got two new political parties emerging. You want to be able to discuss the Whigs versus the Democratic Party. The Democrats are led by Andrew Jackson, with the idea that Andrew Jackson is very nervous about the growth of the federal government, especially the bus, which he is going to kill. He is going to exercise governmental power, though, by ignoring Worcester versus Georgia with the Trail of Tears. He is going to impose a tariff that is going to then cause a nullification crisis that he threatens to deal with military action. So Jackson is aggressive in making decisions that he is about. Henry Clay is leading the Whigs, and the Whigs believe in what he calls his American system. He wants to create a brand new third Bank of the United States. He wants to create tariffs. He wants to create federally funded internal improvements. But at this time, they're talking about during the Monroe presidency when he is just trying to recreate a second one of these, and then his ambition after Jackson kills that one is he's going to want to create a third. Each of these programs, though, is going to get into a battle over federal versus state control. So when we talk states' rights during the Civil Rights Unit, that states' rights argument was popping up at this time, too, when many Democrats were nervous about the growth of the government. So this plan only created the national road, and then almost every other infrastructure project was funded by states or local interests, like the Erie Canal is a state-run program, not a federal program. We are going to then see this box right here. This is all about one word. They want you to be able to talk about how sectionalism trumps nationalism from this point forward. Specifically over slavery and the impact it's having over the economy. Now we can move on to the next page. In the next section, it describes how there's a new national culture where people are developing distinctive cultures of their own. This box right here has a lot of stuff going on with it. They're making the point that democracy, individualism, rationalism, which is a denial of like a religious worldview, but instead it's a more scientific worldview, and changes caused by the market revolution, along with mobility, contributed to a second Great Awakening. Second Great Awakening is the key word that's inside that section right there. This re-examination of religion that happens in the early 1800s is going to inspire reform movements in the North, not reform movements in the South. Some of these reform movements are going to be utopian societies where people just go off in the wilderness, kind of like Brook Farm, or the Shakers who didn't believe in sexual activity, or the Oneida who really believed in sexual activity. And so you're going to have all these people who have different worldviews, but then also you have these reformers who hear religious speakers come around, And what the religious people are going to say is if you believe in God, you will actively work to get rid of evil inside your society. So the names that you could think about would be like Dorothea Dix, trying to deal with like prisons and mental institutions. You could talk about like Horace Mann with public education. But the big ones you want to be able to notice are temperance and abolition and women's suffrage. Those are your big three reform movements that they're alluding to when they mention that section. Your next two boxes are talking about how America is developing their own culture with their own art, literature, philosophy, and architecture. I cannot imagine that this is going to be a huge portion of your test, but it's there. So let me give you some terms you can use for this. Remember, with artwork, this is the time period of the Hudson River School, where they have like landscapes of like the Adirondack Mountains with a river going through it and the wild areas behind. And so that's a new art form that's really taking off in America. They talk to you about like Nathaniel Hawthorne and Henry David Thoreau and other authors who are involved in like transcendentalism and thinking about how the world could be examined in different ways. But I can't imagine that outside of that and maybe some architecture talking about how we're in a new colonial time period, I really don't see this as being a major portion of your test. This box right down here is talking about how African Americans have agency both by protecting their culture on the plantations where they're working, but also in freedom that they are working actively to try to agitate for change. And I'd like to remind you of two groups that you should be able to talk about during this time. Number one, American Colonization Society. That was the early attempt at civil rights, where there are people who are arguing that for African Americans, we should figure out ways to help African Americans get home to Africa, even though that's not where they're originally from. And then that's followed up later by William Lloyd Garrison at the end of this time period with his American Anti-Slavery Society. That's going to be much more about radical abolitionism. This is asking about African Americans, though, so being able to mention people like Sojourner Truth or Frederick Douglass or others that we've learned about, David Walker, in our class would be really good. This is where they mention then those organizations and the reform movements. The previous page and this page are key to link together. Second Great Awakening leads to reform movements. Increasing numbers of Americans inspired by religion and intellectual movements worked outside the government to advance their ideas. So number one, notice the temperance societies that are popping up to try to fight back against alcohol, as well as dealing with other problems. And specifically, the people who are working on this are oftentimes middle to upper income urban women who are part of the cult of domesticity. And so many of these women are looking for opportunities to advance themselves and to be able to work on making change, and so that's where they're coming from. Letter B is pointing out that the abolitionist movement is making gains in the North, not in the South. And specifically, that's what you want to see with the Second Great Awakening. It splits churches into like Northern and Southern Baptist, Northern and Southern Methodist. You're going to see divisions where this is the earliest signs that we've got a civil war coming. Remember to blend B and C together, where women at Seneca Falls will rewrite the Declaration to push for suffrage, but it's suffrage for all, not just women, but also African Americans, with the idea that whoever gets through the door first will then help pull the other group through simultaneously. And that's why women are going to be so mad with the 19th Amendment. They will then move on to their own issues, feeling like African Americans have already gotten more than women have, and that'll lead towards a push for the 19th Amendment. We've now laid out the social conditions that are causing sectionalism. And that's what we want to be noticing as we're building up your Civil War essay. So I'm going to be giving to you the idea that there's probably 5 body paragraphs for a Civil War essay that you can get into. Social conditions, economic conditions, political conditions, expansion in territory, and then the turning of territory into states. Those 5 things are all combining to cause a civil war to happen, and they're all happening in this packet. Your competition, though, is just going to write down something like the South loved slavery and the North hated it, and that's where their essay is coming from. You'll be more distinctive by being able to get into the categories of all the different ways that we're sectionalizing. So this area right here is about economics. New transportation systems and technology massively expanded manufacturing and agricultural production. So this is part of your market revolution, where you're having people who are specializing in products, and we're now ending what we call subsistence farming, where you just farm the food that you're going to eat, and instead you start mass producing goods, whether it's cotton in the South, wheat in the breadbasket, or you build a factory to send stuff out. We now have a way to mass produce things using all of the inventions that we have in Box B. So Box B, where you've got like textile mills like you have with Lowell and his Lowell girls, or you have steam engines like what's being used by Robert Fulton with Fulton's Folly, the Claremont, which is your steamboat that can go up and down rivers. Interchangeable parts that allows you to mass produce machinery. The telegraph, agricultural inventions like the McCormick Reaper and the John Deere steel plow, all of these things are allowing businesses to massively increase their production of stuff. We will also see that the government is stepping in to try to help out with building transportation networks, and this was part of what Henry Clay called his American system. His American system was that the government should build tariffs that are going to give an advantage to American businesses by making it more expensive for Europeans to compete with Americans. He also was talking about building a bus to help out economically, but then thirdly, he talked about building infrastructure, roads, and canals that will allow people to transport stuff quickly. The federal government, though, under Madison and Monroe, felt like that was unconstitutional. So they built the national road going into the Midwest, but otherwise each individual state starts building their own, like the Erie Canal and other canal systems and road systems that are in the north. In the South, they aren't building a lot of transportation because most farmers are along the rivers, and so they've already got transportation, and if they don't, they're probably not a rich person that's being listened to anyways. And so for the rich planters, they're totally fine just moving up and down the waterways they have. And so you're going to see that there are transportation networks that link the North and the Midwest, and this is going to foster the growth of wealth, and it's going to attract immigrants, and that's going to allow a boom that's going to take the North in a much different direction than the South. So that's your economics page, talking about how sectionalism is developing, which is also creating tensions between the North and the South when it comes to the idea of a potential civil war. The market revolution is going to have an impact on society. So we're back to the idea that there's social changes that are happening specifically with your northern market revolution. Many people are moving to factories, or they're growing food on farms that are being transporting goods to far away distant places. This is why Henry Clay's bus was so important. We don't have a currency that can foster long-distance trade. We don't even have money supply for that. And that's not going to get fixed until Abe Lincoln starts printing greenbacks. So if you want to put that connection in, that you're still going to have a money supply that's holding them back, that would be fine. The growth of manufacturing drove a significant increase in prosperity and standards of living for some, and the middle class boomed. You also have a large group of people who are laboring inside the factories for poor working conditions and poor pay, and so they're having struggles. But oftentimes these are either immigrants, and there's an element of nativism. This is when your know-nothing party will pop up. Or else these are farm kids who are not needed on the farm anymore, and they're moving to the cities. This last box is all about how women are seeing their lives change as you move into the city, because there are now spheres for men and women. For women, their sphere is the home. That's the cult of domesticity. For the men, their sphere is the workplace. And so unlike being on the farm where everybody works together, men and women have different spheres that they're involved with. You should make a note in this box because it's a nitpick for you guys, even though it's a big deal for a history person who's reading your stuff. Kids will sometimes get confused. The previous time period's description of the ideal woman was known as Republican motherhood. That was the idea during the Revolution, that women are supposed to raise really good patriotic kids to try to help make America the best democratic place we can. This era is known as the cult of domesticity, where they still hold the same values as Republican motherhood. Women should be educated, they should train their kids, but it's with the idea that the women have a separate place, and that their place is to be a homemaker, where the farm wife is going to be doing everything the man does to try to make profits. We highlight this right here, though, because many of these women will end up in reform movements, so you want to make that link between the two. Your next box that you have, economic development shapes settlement and patterns, helping to unite the nation while encouraging the growth of different regions. So you have massive migration happening in the cities, happening with two groups. Number one, immigrants. Number two, farm kids who aren't needed on the farms anymore. And when those areas are filling up, many people are moving into the Ohio River Valley, the Mississippi River Valley to become farmers. But it's rare for immigrants to move south. They're moving north instead, where there's transportation networks. You could be a small-time farmer or a factory worker without having a large investment in a plantation. So the South is not appealing to poor people who are moving into our country. In the South, they are relying on cotton production, which means they are trading, and they're interacting with northern banks, northern markets, international trading partners. But what these guys are recognizing is their dependence on trade is going to create a regional identity where the South is different than everybody else. They depend on slaves. They don't want to give up slavery. They've got a class system that is reinforcing segregation. And there's a feeling of oppression where many of these Southerners feel like they're contributing something great in cotton, but they're being picked on because Northern tariffs are making their goods more expensive. And they're having trouble trading overseas because other countries are creating reciprocal tariffs that are hitting our goods when they go overseas. And when people buy stuff in the South, they have to buy it from northern factories, which means that money is not staying in the South, it's going up north. This plan that you see right here to try to further unify the country, known as the American system, was created by Henry Clay. Henry Clay's idea was to create a brand new bus. Southern farmers, especially Andrew Jackson, hate a brand new bus. Henry Clay's idea for a tariff system makes Southerners mad, especially you see that in South Carolina with the nullification crisis. Transportation networks, Southerners hate the idea of paying taxes for a northern canal, so all of Henry Clay's ideas sound better in the north than they do in the south, and there's a feeling that Henry Clay is taking us in the wrong direction, but Andrew Jackson's taking us in the right when you talk to Southerners. If you move to your next box, this is your foreign policy page. And so your foreign policy page is getting into your idea of what's happening as America is struggling to create an independent global presence, and they're going to start claiming territory. So following the Louisiana Purchase, the United States government sought influence and control over North America and the Western Hemisphere through a variety of means. So the way to look at this is after the Louisiana Purchase, remember the Adams-Onis Treaty, that's the thing that's going to get us Florida. Texas Revolution, which is going to eventually be absorbed into the United States with the presidency of Polk. And then this is also the era where we're going to get the Oregon Territory and the Mexican cession of the southwestern United States. You'll also notice that they're mentioning that there is American Indian removal. This is your era of the Trail of Tears, the Battle of Tippecanoe with William Henry Harrison. And so there's an active effort to move Indians out of the way. And the view is to move them west of the Mississippi River in what's known as the Great American Desert, where we're going to find farmland that's not really built to farming without irrigation strategies. Finally, notice the Monroe Doctrine, where Americans are going to announce to the rest of the world that the Americas are the domain of the United States. We're going to stay out of European affairs. They're expected to stay out of our affairs. We cannot enforce the Monroe Doctrine, though. Our armies are nowhere close to being prepared to be able to do that. Who's the first president to really demonstrate that he was enforcing the Monroe Doctrine by creating his own corollary? Teddy Roosevelt. And so you're going to find that once we get to the early 1900s, it's this foundation, this announcement that then becomes our imperialism as we start moving into other parts of the world to try to express American dominance. Frontier settlers tended to champion expansion efforts, while American Indian resistance led to a sequence of wars and federal efforts to control and relocate American Indian populations. Battle of Tippecanoe, Battle of Fallen Timbers during Washington's time, the War of 1812, where you have the British and their Native American allies who are pushed out of the way, Trail of Tears. All of these things weave into this moment inside your concept outline. So we've now laid out the idea that we are acquiring territory out on the west. And as we acquire territory, it's creating a sectional divide because the battle we're going to have over each territorial acquisition is what sort of state will it become. So we've now built up that there's a political divide between Democrats and Whigs following the battle between Democratic Republicans and Federalists. You now have an economic divide over what the market revolution has done with the North and the South with industrialization versus cotton production. We've also learned about socially the Second Great Awakening. And so the final thing they start getting into is the contest that you're going to have between the North and the South whenever it comes time to acquire and add new states. So first of all, notice that in the South, that use of slavery to grow cotton is incredibly destructive to the soil, so is tobacco. So there's a pattern of people settling out east and then moving west as they play out their land, and they want to continue farming in the same way that they've done previously. This is why you have a crisis in Texas, where Texans bring in their slaves into the Texas territory. Even though Santa Anna and the Mexican government's going to make slavery illegal, they'll still bring them in with the idea that this is their choice to do what they want to with their property. And so we see a battle between two different cultures that are moving out west and trying to acquire territory. In the North, anti-slavery people are going to be very much focused on the idea that slavery is absolutely evil. And so in the 1840s, this is when William Lloyd Garrison is going to make his turn from gradual abolitionist to radical abolitionist. And that turn is going to then create tensions because in the South, Southerners are not going to be interested in giving up their rights to own slaves, even though most of them don't own slaves. They very much are into the idea of maintaining this class system so that you do not then have a mixing of the races or a breakdown of their social structure. You're going to have attempts at compromise inside our United States government, and whenever you see the term compromise, that's Henry Clay, the great compromiser. But this is not going to permanently stop the problems you're going to have with sectionalism between the North and the South. So when we think about then what's building up as a tension, because this is where you end period 4 and you're ready to move into then the immediate causes of the Civil War, we've now laid out the long-term causes for why the Civil War is coming. But if you remember the Missouri Compromise, this was a battle over Missouri, which was in this area that was west of the Mississippi, and Henry Clay had to work out a deal. In order for Missouri to become a slave state, what state had to become a free state? Maine. So Maine's a free state, Missouri's a slave state. They create their 3630 line across the bottom of Missouri to control what parts of Louisiana Purchase are free or slave. And you want to remember the balance is important in Congress, but specifically in the Senate. This is a conversation we took for about 15 minutes when we were going our way through this in the wintertime. But please remember that after the Constitution was created, we created the 3/5 Compromise. That was a rigging of the Constitution to give more power to the South because they had less white people because they were dependent on slavery. By the time of the 1820s, in the House of Representatives, the South is losing control over the House because in the North their population is rising due to immigration. When this immigration is taking place, the South is now nervous that when the House falls, the only thing keeping slavery alive is a balance in the Senate that we call equilibrium. And so that's the term that you'd want to use in that box to describe why compromise is so important at this point. You'll also remember that during this time period, you saw weird things happening in Congress to show how desperate the South was. Like, you should jot down that this is the period of the gag rule, where you have in the Congress a rule prohibiting people from even mentioning slavery with the idea that that would be explosive enough to actually destroy our union that we had going on. But when we look at the end of this time period, your stage is now set. Sectionally, economically, politically, we are now sectionalized. And so what I'd like to do is take a moment with your neighbors, explain what sectionally, economically, and socially is creating the divisions that have now created a North and a South rather than a national United States. Does anybody need more time? So is there any element about politically, socially, or economically what's causing sectional tensions that you need to have explained or fleshed out a little bit more before we wrap up for today? Cool. So the next step is this. Once you've got those underlying threads down, these are the tensions that are between the North and the South, take a moment and see with your neighbors if you can explain from 1800 to 1848 what acquisitions of territory we had in their correct order that is going to cause tensions over statehood. So go ahead and try that and see if you can get that done.
Like they bought it again at purchase, but then there was a restriction on how all of a sudden they all
All right, let's stop you. So Jefferson's purchase is what? Louisiana Purchase. And then shortly after the War of 1812, when Andrew Jackson invades Florida and everybody flips out in Spain, and the Spanish are told, I guess you can't defend your territory, we took over what place with the Addison Street? We took over Florida. We then had a revolution that happened in territory controlled by Mexico, Texas. We then had a threat of 54-40-year fight by James K. Polk, but then he backed off to Oregon for the 49th parallel with Puget Sound. And then finally we had what session that became California. Perfect. So then here's what I want you to think about. From 1820 to 1850, we had a willingness to compromise. 1820, we had compromise. But then notice what happened afterwards as sectional tensions start rising. Nullification crisis starts causing tensions. We have problems going on between the North and the South with the gag rule, with the feeling that abolition is out of control. And what I'd like you to notice is for next week, keep in mind those speeches that I had to read in December when you're taking a look at Seward, Calhoun, Clay, and Webster. And keep in mind these mentalities. Calhoun, Webster, and Clay, this is their last action in 1850, because in 1848, the Mexican-American War is done. What do they discover in California in 1849? And then in 1850, California wants to become a free state. Henry Clay's got his Missouri Compromise. His Missouri Compromise has 4 points. We're going to make California free. We're going to put into place a new fugitive slave law where Northerners are going to be obligated to round up slaves who are then seen as being in the wrong place. We're going to get rid of the D.C. slave trade, and also we are going to create popular sovereignty out west in the southwestern desert frontier that still protects Louisiana Purchase with that 36-30 line. So you got this really complicated compromise. When you think about that moment, remember, Daniel Webster from Massachusetts throughout his entire career kept saying, now and forever, one and inseparable, this union must stay together. So you've got a northern and southern working together. Calhoun, though, comes flying in, and Calhoun says, I know this is going to sound like a bit much, but I've got people in Nashville who want to secede immediately. And he tells them, what you're going to do is you're going to give us California, even if they want to become free, you're not going to let that happen. And then secondarily, you're going to rewrite the Constitution to give half the power to the South, half the power to the North, and if you don't do it, there will be a civil war. So Henry Clay is facing a huge threat from John C. Calhoun of secession. Because what's about to happen is when we add California, it will throw off equilibrium in what branch of Congress? the Senate. Senate will be northern, House will be northern, and the only thing protecting the South will be what? The president. And at that time, that was Zach Taylor, who was like, forget that. I'm gonna make the South mad. It doesn't matter. I'm just gonna make California free. Forget all this business. Then he drops it of film and charities. Then he's replaced by Millard Fillmore, who's like, of course I'm gonna make a deal. So we patch things up. And then after Fillmore is what president? He's part of what party? The Democrat. And Jacksonian Democrats, did they like slavery?
Yeah.
Yes. So we're safe. Who follows Pierce? Buchanan. What party he part of? Democrat. Like slavery. We're safe. Who's next? Of course we're back. Right? Now the other person, remember from our speeches, William Seward. So William Seward is that guy who's Secretary of State for Lincoln. He'll eventually buy Alaska. But remember, he comes swinging into the whole mess, and he's like, I don't need to compromise because we got more people, we got more factories, we got more guns. If you want to fight, I will fight you. I am thrilled with that. Let's just put up each issue to a vote, and we'll get everything. You get nothing. And in fact, he said, I respond to a higher law, that I listen to what God tells me, which connects us back to what religious movement. You guys good? I did good. Okay, cool. So that's, I mean, if you're capable of doing, like, hanging with me through that, you're doing a really good job. So that's where we pick up next week. We pick up at 35. That's Civil War Reconstruction, Rebuilding King and Gilded Age. But we're doing great with our review process so far. And if you're finding that I'm moving too fast or you got questions or whatever, don't hesitate to ask. I'd love to help you out. But otherwise, we're done for today unless you need anything else from me.
Thank you.